I've been fortunate enough to know and work with all three of these wonderful women, but for those of you who don't know them, Aidan is the Senior Survivor Voices Officer at Refuge, took a BA in Modern Languages and Cultures, which is my own background, of course, in 2005 to 9, but then did a graduate diploma in law in 2011 to 12 at the College of Law in London. And Aidan, at some point, it would be interesting for you to talk about that choice and that change in your path. Helen is the Director for Award Management and Donor Compliance at Save the Children International. So compliance has become a huge issue, hasn't it, across the charitable sector in recent years, Helen. It's a very important role. And Helen studied law as an undergraduate here and then did a sabbatical year as the elected JCR President in 2005 to 6. Helen then completed her LLM in International Human Rights and Humanitarian Law as a mature student at Essex from 2017 to 2022. And again, we're very aware in Durham, our numbers of mature students are actually quite small, but what they do in terms of taking on further study at that point in their life is, I think, a source of great respect and admiration for us, but does have its own challenges, doesn't it? Which I think would be helpful for us to explore. And then Olivia, Director at Lucid Launch, Product Design, did a BA in History in 2010 to 13, but then took on a postgraduate certificate in Web Design and Development from 2017 to 2018 and launched Lucid Design in October 2022. So here we have three extraordinary trajectories. And what I'm going to do is invite each of you in turn to talk for about 10 minutes about that trajectory. And then we will take some questions and then we will let the discussion develop from there.
Yeah, when I left Durham, I didn't really have any idea what I wanted to do. And I just was a little bit clueless, and I ended up having a year where I pretty much did nothing. I lived with my brother, which was quite straining for both of us, but it was obviously affordable for me, so it worked out well. But I didn't really know what I was doing, so I applied for a journalism master's at Columbia in New York, thinking I'll go into journalism. And then I was sort of waiting to hear back from that, and it was going to take a few months. And my brother was just like, well, why don't you also apply for a couple of graduate schemes? And I was like, oh yeah, okay, good idea. So I applied for actually I applied for the personnel graduate scheme at Tesco. Got an email back saying, sorry, that one's full, but we've got some space on the tesco.com graduate scheme. And I just thought, literally no idea what tesco.com would be all about or anything, but I was like, yeah, sure, fine. So it was just it was chaos, I would say. Like, I just didn't know what I was doing, but I just went for it. I actually managed to get both offers. So I got the Tesco grad scheme and the Columbia placement, which was a surprise to everyone. But then I had to sort of decide, right, okay, which one should I go for? Should I go for some guaranteed income, or should I go for a master's, which is obviously going to be insanely expensive? So I went for the Tesco.com graduate scheme, and was very nervous about it. Didn't really know, what it was going to be like, or if I'd even be able to do it. I had a bit of imposter syndrome, I think. Started out and did this 1 year grad scheme, which was kind of rotating around the Tesco.com business, which is obviously their basically online food shopping business. And it was really interesting. I did 4 placements of 3 months each across their operational departments. So everything from like how they get the products off the shelves and into the vans, into the customer's door, rotated around that department. And then I went to the kind of digital department. And that's when I was like, oh, this is actually quite cool and quite interesting. And it was this whole kind of world of kind of language and process that was completely alien to me. They were talking about kind of agile product development, and people were sort of obsessed with kind of certain ways of working, and there were lots of conferences, and it just seemed like this whole kind of door had been opened to this world that I just knew absolutely nothing about, didn't even know it existed. And it was really interesting to me. And So I thought, right, this is actually definitely where I want to be. I want to be kind of learning this stuff. And I think it appealed mostly because product development, digital product development, is considered to be a craft. So it's kind of something that you have to have a certain level of expertise in. It's quite a specialist field, but it's an interesting field because you may be working in retail 1 minute, but you can actually get a job anywhere because the skills that you apply are the same. So I've ended up working across retail, transport, travel, fintech, just loads of different industries, always in the capacity of a product manager, which is somebody who sits between the business, the customer, and the development team, and basically kind of prioritizes and manages the development of the digital products and makes the right decisions about what we're going to build and when we're going to build it. And so, yeah, in that capacity, I've worked at lots of different companies, startups to kind of large corporations. And I've been lucky to be able to travel with that as well. So I've been all over the UK, but I've also been out to LA and Mexico and various different places working as a product manager. So it's been a really exciting career. But there was, as a product manager, you always work with designers who are the people that, you know, you take your requirements to. For example, if we're talking about like a login field or something, I might say, right, the user needs to be able to put in their email address and a password, and then the designer will make that look really nice and work really effectively. And that's user experience and user interface design. That's kind of what it's called, or more holistically, it's known as product design. And I was always just fascinated by what they did, because there's always a psychology element to it, kind of making sure that what's called the affordance is right. So does everything look, you know, does a button look like a button? Will people know what's going to happen next when they click on a certain thing? There's loads that goes into design. And I always thought it was really interesting, but I thought, well, I've got a history degree. I'm not very arty. So it's probably a bit too late for me to go into that. So I'll just keep being a product manager, that's fine. But I was always the product manager that was really overly involved in the design process. I'd always be like, you know, like looking over the designer's shoulder and trying to be like, oh, what are you doing? What are you doing? Or I'd just rock up with kind of my own sketch and be like, I've drawn this. I think this is really nice. What do you think? Yeah, that was always me. And so anyway, I worked pretty hard to get to a certain level within the product management career. I got to head of product level for Haven, which is the caravan holiday company in the UK. So I was head of product for all of their on-park digital technology. So looking after kind of everything from their digital arrivals process, making sure that customers could get in through the front gate, to the activities booking systems, the food and beverage products, the entertainment systems, everything that was used on the parks and for the customer when they were actually on holiday was kind of my remit. So it's a huge remit. And I did that for 2 years. And then I just started thinking, what's next? I was like, right, well, next would be product director. And then, you know, I don't know, after that, something else and something else. And I just thought, I'm going down a trajectory here that I don't think I love anymore. I think I've achieved what I wanted to, which was the head of product position. And at that point, I decided, right, I'm actually going to make a change, and I'm going to go into design now for like as my thing, because I realized I had this like light bulb moment where I was like, it's actually not too late to change. If anything, I'd be committing myself to another 35 years of something I don't want to do. I'd be better to change now than commit. So what I actually did was as you mentioned, Susan, I did a sort of postgraduate certificate in 2017 in design, just to try and get a bit more skill underneath my belt. And then when I made the decision to change my career a few years later, I did another course, which was a bootcamp course at a company called Experience House, which was a 3-month full-time boot camp. And there's a good reason that's not on my CV, which I'll come on to in a minute. But I did that for 3 months, built up a portfolio, and then I decided to launch my own venture, basically being a freelance designer. So I launched Lucid Launch, which is my company. and now pick up kind of freelance design work. And also if it comes through the door, I'll do some product management as well, but mostly just design work now. And the reason why Experience House isn't on my LinkedIn is because I now actually teach the course. So I finished it last month, and I now actually teach it. So the director has sort of said, well, maybe get that off your LinkedIn. so that you've got a bit more, you don't look like you've just graduated and now you're teaching it, basically. So that's me.
Wonderful. No, that's an extraordinary narrative, and I do think it's helpful when we have people saying to young people who are just starting out, if you find you're no longer happy with what you're doing, have the courage to make a change. It really matters.
Yeah, so yeah, I think it's fair to say I've had quite a unique sort of career path sort of since graduating. And I think, yeah, I think if I sort of think about it, in terms of sort of the route from doing the law conversion in the sector I work in now, yeah, because I think I've been working in the charity sector now for about probably about 10 years. I think, yeah, it's an interesting one, because I think I always sort of wanted to do a law degree, but I think for me, which yeah, I'm not sure whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. I think I went into the law sort of knowing how hard it would be to eventually get a training contract. And I think there is a bit of a danger sometimes with sort of pursuing, I think it's, you know, I don't know, yeah, to use this analogy, I think sort of wanting to pursue a law degree and that sort of being your sort of only sort of tunnel vision is, I think, is a bit similar to maybe wanting to pursue something in acting, for example. And you sort of look at sort of what you need to, you know, how hard it is, you know, all the training and all the extra work, and both professions, you know, very fantastic, very credible, very awarding professions, but to sort of get sort of that goal, I sort of just went into it thinking, it was like, you know what, it's going to be really it will be really, really useful to me, and I learned so much. But I think I was also just quite realistic in terms of my options. So I didn't want to go and thinking, okay, if I don't get a training contract, that means, you know, that will do. I didn't want it to define me. So I think after I did sort of the law conversion legal practice certificate, I was, yeah, and I think because I've always, my background is mainly with children and young people, and I've been working for Refuge for the last 3 years now. My first role was a frontline role, working with survivors of domestic abuse and children, representing them at panel meetings, safety planning, risk assessment. And I moved to a role in the campaigns policy and fundraising team in my current role, where I work with survivors who do our external engagement. So I think because I've always wanted to sort of my area has always been, I've always wanted to sort of work with children and young people especially. And I think I've always been really, yeah, I think I've always just been quite driven to sort of advocate for sort of what's fair and what's right. And I think the role that I had prior to starting at Refuge, I was an advocate at a charity for 4 years. And that was a really good opportunity for me to use my law degree, because I spent a lot of the time sort of looking at school legislation to do with schools and using that to challenge exclusion, a lot of young people and children who had often been unfairly excluded. So it was, so yeah, it was quite useful. So yeah, I'm really grateful that I was able to study, that I was able to study law. But I think, yeah, in terms of, I think I was probably quite lucky in the sense that I always knew that I wanted to sort of work in a sector with children, young people. And I got into the role that I'm in now because I was able to access some training with the council that I worked with previously. And you know, the domestic abuse sector was always something that I knew you know, I knew about, but then this training and working with survivors who had been impacted by that. So that's why I moved over. That's why I moved over to Refuge. So yeah, I think I would say to sort of anyone, you know, when they're finishing thinking about what they want to do, I do think it's important to do something that that you at least like. I think I always used to say, oh, you know, you should do something that you're really, really passionate about. And whilst I think that's really good, I don't think that's something which is always the case. I think sometimes it is, and it's great. But I think when I was at school, I was always like, oh, you know, you have to do something that you love, something you're passionate about. And I think I would say aim to do something that you like. And if you end up, I'd say do something that you like. But I would also say don't feel pressured into doing something out of obligation or expectation. And I'm not even saying that on a sort of financial level, because you know, everyone sort of has different circumstances. But I think, you know, if you've always been told, you know, you should do this thing, you should be a doctor, you should, you know, you should work in this sector, you should do this. I think it can be quite, I think when you've always been told to do something, it's very hard to sort of shake that. It's hard to shake that, and it's hard to think, oh, but I'm not able to do anything else because this is all I've been told. And I think, you know, that's sort of like the great thing about having sort of forums like this, and being able to meet people and asking for advice from people. So yeah, and I think so overall I would just say, I guess my sort of career path hasn't sort of followed like a sort of linear trajectory, but each job that I've had, I've learned a lot from, and ultimately it's led me to somewhere I want to be now.
Happy International Women's Day to everybody. And can I just firstly say that it is an absolute privilege to be on this panel with these wonderful speakers, and I include you within that, Susan, of course, in your role and what you work to do for the students in St Aidan's. So thank you for that. So I currently hold the role of Global Director for Award Management and Donor Compliance. So as Susan alluded to before, this covers a couple of key things, really. So this is a very professional function, and people often forget that in charities it is a professional area. It's not lots of just goodwill volunteers. Of course, we're there for our values, but it is a professional sector. So from a grants and awards management perspective, we are the ones that manage the funding and make sure that while our program teams, our technical experts are there on the ground delivering our programs to make change for children, we're the ones who are looking at the funding requirements, the contractual terms, and making sure that we are being accountable to our donors and to the communities that we serve. So in this role, I am the global head of function across Save the Children International, and provide that cross-movement support to Save the Children Alliance. So Save the Children is made up of lots of different legal entities, and I won't go into all of the detail of that here, but we have 25,000 staff globally and work across 118 different countries. So it's a huge organisation with a huge impact for children, a huge amount of potential as to what we can continue to do as we champion child's rights. Now, within that, I manage a team of managers and direct reports within that in our HQ office, which is about 23 people, but I have oversight and provide direct technical support as well to our regional colleagues who then work with our country teams. So I work with a diverse and wonderful set of people across the globe. And actually, that's one thing I really love is the global remit. It does mean often that there are sometimes funny times of night that I'm doing calls and things like that, but absolutely right, because it's not for me to set that time. We need to adjust according to where our work is happening and so on. So we do that accordingly. Now, I think it's worth bearing in mind, I graduated 18 years ago. So it's a long time, and it takes time to get to where you want to go, and you know, it doesn't mean that it won't change beyond that, right? So I similarly to Olivia and Idu have had quite a weaving career path over the years. But if I go back to when I graduated from Durham in 2005 with my law degree, I think it's worth talking a little bit to what makes me me, and therefore how that influenced the decisions that I took at the time. Because I recognize, you know, as Idu said, everyone's different, all of our circumstances are different, and therefore the choices that we have to make, or sometimes feel like we fall into, to be honest, don't fully feel like our own, and that's okay. And I think it's worth calling some of that out. So, you know, I think when I started my law degree, and this is a very dated reference, but, you know, I was inspired by the films Erin Brockovich, you know, very much the idea of this human rights lawyer, kind of, you know, championing the people. And that was the ambition that I'd had going into it. But if I'm honest, I was very involved in lots of extracurricular things at Durham, and therefore was always warned that, you know, be careful how much time you spend on that, because it will impact your outcomes academically. And I made those choices consciously, right? And came out from Durham with a 2-2. Now, as you can imagine, at that point, you're bombarded by all of these messages from exactly those things, you know, that this is setting to counter, where it's, you know, you can't succeed unless you get a 2-1 or a first, you're competing with the Oxford and Cambridge of the world, forget it. And I can still remember comments from another student who'd basically said, well, you'll never get a training contract with a 2-2, so what's the point? And my confidence was really affected by that. Now, I didn't know what to do, where I'd go, and I came from a working class family with not very much money. I'd paid a lot of my own way through Durham, so I can't imagine how that is for students now, that with the sheer amount of debt and so on that they're facing. But I came out with a lot of debt, and I similarly couldn't afford to go and do a voluntary internship with someone like the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in the UN for free in another country and pay all of the living expenses of that. So I felt a bit lost. However, one thing that I was really passionate about, and I'd learned a huge amount, was getting involved in the Junior Common Room, the JCR, and was fortunate enough to be elected for the JCR President role. So really threw my all into that, to be honest, and didn't really think about the rest too much. So got very involved. And to be honest, what really drove me and what it was all about for me was actually trying to support students and to create that unrivaled experience that Durham, because I think Durham is unique in what it offers, and that, you know, you're all very fortunate to be at Durham for that collegiate experience, and, you know, the unique identity that each college has and that Aidan's has. I will say, you know, years later, you may find that you're still in touch with many of these people, and the huge network that brings for you. So it's wonderful, and I think creates a bit of an imprint on you that you take with you wherever you go. So as I was going through the president role, I was thinking through what I want to do, and I could hear my parents' voice at the back of my head, because, you know, we hadn't had much money growing up. So it was all about working for money and not necessarily earning a fortune, but you've got to pay your way. And being able to pay off the debt was a big thing that was hanging over me. Now, another student, a friend, had pointed out a graduate scheme with Mars Incorporated, so the chocolate company, but they also make chocolate pet foods. They work in all sorts of different areas, and said, hey, like, I've seen this grad scheme and I've read the profile, and this sounds like they're looking for you. I think you should apply for it. And again, you know, similar to what you were saying, Olivia, I was a bit like, well, all right, I mean, it sounds interesting, sounds like a great training opportunity, so why not? I'll apply. And I got it. And, you know, it wasn't the only thing I applied for, to be honest, but I got it, and I decided, why not? Let's go for it. It's worth saying as well, I did also apply to one master's course, only one, because again, I didn't quite have the confidence, but I put myself forward for a human rights law master's at Liverpool and got rejected. So again, I was like, right, well, clearly I can't go and do law and run away. So my confidence there was really affected. So I went to Mars and thought, you know, this is an interesting company. It's a good graduate scheme, and I see that as an opportunity to learn. But everything that they talked about in terms of the Mars principles, so their values that they were grounded in, sounded really interesting to me and played into a lot of the things that I thought motivated me at work. So during my time with Mars, I did a whole raft of different things and was really fortunate to move around. So I did a year in procurement, doing procurement for wet food, for pet food, so pedigree brand and things like that. As glamorous as that sounds, driving to abattoirs with our quality assurance team, doing sourcing tenders for like grain for dry cereals and things like that. So, you know, really interesting and great great training ground to understand a bit more about how the supply chain works. Now, with the Mars grad scheme, you move around every year and you can choose whether or not you want to specialize or be a generalist. And I was very much on the page of, I want to just learn the breadth. One thing I realized about myself is that I love to step back and see how things are connected. So I then went from there to marketing, and I was the brand manager for the Mars brand in the UK for a year, very much thrown in the deep end of, there's your 4 million marketing budget, £4 million. Off you go, and you know, you're working with the marketing agencies to design our campaign and implement it this year. Terrifying, but an excellent training ground. It went really well, you know, very successful, but I also realized that I didn't really enjoy marketing. I loved working with people, but actually, you know, very great career for many people that are in it, but it didn't resonate for me. I wanted that felt a bit more grounded and in the operations with people. So made the case that my next role would be in operations. Now, at this point, I moved to be an operations shift manager in the factory in Slough for the chocolate business. So, you know, I'd gone from marketing the chocolate to making the chocolates and managing a team of 60 in the factory. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, at that point, the factory was a very male-dominated environment, which I think is worth calling out. And I could see the rolled eyes initially from some of the other managers on shift, because I was one of a team of 8 managers and we rotated through on our shifts, you know, rolling, oh, it's that girl from marketing. What does she know about operations? But, you know, recognizing that it was a very male dominated environment, I said, okay, well, actually, what are the things that I know and what are the things that I can learn? And actually, how do I bring my strengths to be my authentic self in managing this team? I'm not going to try and claim to be, you know, a qualified mechanic or to know the ins and outs of how to operate machines, but I know how to work with people, to hold us accountable for results, to get the best out of people. I'm comfortable making decisions from the information that I'm faced with. So these are all things that I'd learned about myself, but it meant that actually I approached that role, you know, as my authentic self, to be a female leader, and all the other things that make me me. To say, okay, well, what am I going to do about this and how am I going to approach it? And actually ended up being one of the most successful shift managers, where staff engagement improved tremendously and we were the highest performing shift in terms of staff engagement. Our results were fantastic, non-quality costs reduced and so on. So it was great. And actually to this day, that team and managing that team and that environment where, you know, 3 a.m. and you're in, you know, kind of in the trenches, getting your hands stuck in, that for me is still one of my favorite roles to this day. And it was about working with people. It wasn't about the manufacturing. It was about leading teams. And again, a real learning for me about what it was that I looked to get out of roles. Now, after that, because I ended up graduating off the scheme into that role and did that role for a couple of years. And then we went through quite a turbulent time in Mars, to be honest. So there was a restructure happening. And through that, I was successful in getting another role as the area operations manager for the Galaxy brand in the UK. So basically heading up operations for the Galaxy brand as they restructured the way the business worked into the different segments, basically. So bars as one business, Galaxy and as another, and so on. But I found that whole experience really difficult. And I think for me, it severed something when I was thinking about the Mars values, which they were very much living, but then thinking about how did that resonate with my values personally. And around this same time, I also read a book called Career Anchors, which I would recommend, because actually it helped me understand that we are all motivated by very different things, and that's okay too. So as I mentioned before, some of us will be really passionate about being a specialist and being the expert in something. And you might find that actually you want to have that career and really get into a particular area. You may be someone like me that's a generalist. And there are other things that it talks to as well, like, you know, are you someone that looks for the lifestyle? Is it your values and looking for the sense of service within a role? And for me, I realized on reflection that for me, it was about being a generalist and a sense of service. So I went, okay, I need to make a change. Otherwise, I'm never going to. And I don't want to, I remember actually feeling physically sick, thinking, my goodness, you know, I was having these conversations with leadership about my career journey, and, you know, there would have been great things ahead up to senior management and all sorts, but it just made me feel terrified that actually, is that going to be me in 20 years time? And I'm going to look back and go, what have I done? So I quit. I just quit. And they couldn't believe it. And they were like, well, where are you going? What are they paying you? And I said, well, actually, I don't have anything, and I'm not getting paid, and I'm going to find something in the charity sector. Now, again, not everyone can do this, right? We have bills to pay. We have a roof over our heads. But again, I'd been fortunate that because I'd had this role, I had taken the time to save up a little bit and say, okay, it doesn't give me long term, but I'll save some of that money. And I believe in myself. I'm going to give it a go. You can imagine my parents were going, oh, is this really the right thing to do? Not sure this is a good idea. But again, I kind of fought against that and said, look, I've got to take the chance. And if not, I trust the experience I've had so far. I can always come back and try a job again. So I think a key thing there is, you know, not to be afraid of failure. Recognize that they're not linear, and, you know, take risks, sensible risks that, you know, you've evaluated yourself. But if you're in a position where you're having to make those difficult choices and it's not the right time for you, that's okay too. It doesn't mean that it's a long-term commitment. So I was fortunate to get a voluntary role with Action Against Hunger, which is another charity. They focus on hunger work and food security. I landed in corporate fundraising, actually. So they said, oh, you've come from a corporate and you'll work for free. Great. Interesting in doing corporate fundraising. So I was like, sure, why not? I don't have experience fundraising, but I can figure it out. And it was a great place to learn for a few months while I was applying for other roles. And that's when I got my first opportunity with Save the Children. So I started with Save the Children UK, and I decided when I was applying that I wasn't going to apply straight at the kind of middle management level, because that's where I'd come from. I started at the ground. So I was applying for officer level positions, and I ended up in logistics and procurement. So leaned on my operational and supply chain experience and said, this is how I can translate that. But I recognize it's a different sector. It doesn't necessarily have all the, you know, the whiz bang, the whistles and everything that a big organization like Mars would have. I'm willing to work on paper and forms and whatever it may be, but it's about my values, and that's why I'm willing to make that choice. So, you know, it's starting at a lower salary, of course, but I was okay with doing that. I had a bit of a safety net, but I knew that if that didn't work out, I could make different choices to try and make that work. And since being at Save the Children, I've been really fortunate to move through the organization and again do lots of different things. So I went from logistics and procurement. We were setting up the Save the Children International legal entity at that point, and started transferring parts of the organization into SCI. So supported some of the original procurement setup on secondment, went and worked in our Philippine emergency response as the awards manager, so the grants manager for the Typhoon Haiyan first phase, which was you know, incredibly humbling and very hard work, but a great learning experience. And then went from that to be the awards director in Ethiopia, where I was managing a portfolio of roughly $100 million per year, a portfolio of over 100 awards, and a sizable team there working to implement programs for children across the breadth of Ethiopia. had my first child, and then moved back to the UK. And it was at that point that I took on my master's, actually. So my daughter was 6 months old. I was only able to do that because I have a great support network around me. So my husband and my husband's family, who live in Essex, were able to provide a little bit of support, and did that part-time while I was working for Save the Children. So off my own back, funded by myself, but the organisation was very supportive of me doing that part-time for a period of time. I will say, though, it did take me 5 years to complete it with the children and work and everything else. So be kind to yourself. Part of me was like, I need to finish this in 2 years. Doing this still at this stage in my life, it's okay. Try not to put too much pressure on yourself to have everything straight away. It really can take a long time. So that brings me up to date to where I am in this role. Do I think this is where I'll be long term? Who knows? And I think that's what makes it really exciting. I have specialised a little bit within awards and grants and compliance over the years, but it's been really interesting to move through different roles, and I've had change that way, and being able, as I get more senior, to also shape the direction, which has been a really interesting part for me. So yeah, the key things I would say is just not to be afraid of failure. Career paths aren't linear. Don't be afraid of taking risks, but I do recognize that it's an immense privilege to be able to take risks sometimes. So, don't be afraid if you have to make difficult choices. That's okay. It's a long-term game, and you don't need to have all the answers now. So that's it from me. Thanks.
No, that's wonderful, Helen, and so much in there that's incredibly helpful. And I'm really touched that you're all willing to share the challenges and all the things that you've had to overcome, because I think for so many of our students, that's something that people just don't talk about when they come. Increasingly, we're specifically asking anyone who's coming to Aidan's to give any kind of career talk or advice to do just that. And we have some links with local small business owners, many of whom have had to restart multiple times. But it's still something that is difficult in an environment where, to get to Durham, you're deemed to have had to be incredibly successful already, even though sometimes, sadly, that tends to be measured purely by exam results and not about the whole person that you are. And then the pressure is to be seen to be successful in particular ways at university. And then, of course, to have in mind particular notions of what success looks like. And really, all of us have faced situations where we either feel that we failed, or where the situation is a situation where things haven't gone as people wish. And it may not be anything that anyone in particular has done. And sometimes situations are just horrific in themselves, aren't they? So, if you're working in a disaster zone, a war zone, if you're working with people involved in a situation of gender-based violence or abuse of some kind, if you're working in a sector, an enterprise sector, where really there isn't necessarily the same support that there is often for larger organizations, we all have to be able to pick ourselves up and carry on, don't we? So I'm going to reverse the order now and ask Idu if you can talk to us about some of the challenges that you feel are there. They don't have to be exclusively about as a woman or about other intersectional issues. Please highlight what you think are the important areas. But I think this question of knowing that things will not always go smoothly, being prepared for that, and then how you navigate difficult situations, that it would be helpful if you can include something on that. Thank you.
Sure. I think probably, yeah, something which I found quite difficult at sort of the start of my sort of career was, yeah, I think sort of the multiple sort of rejections that you will get from jobs. And I think, and what sort of sometimes makes it harder is sometimes that you have your peers around you who seem to sometimes just you've got sometimes your peers or your friends who it just seems to be really easy for some of them. But I think, I think, as much as I sort of pride myself, like it's not, there's no guarantee about anything, sort of being in a space and being sort of told no, sort of, at times when you think, hang on a second, I know, I've got these qualifications, I've had this skill, pretty sure the application was good, etc. But then sort of as sort of over the years, when just sort of talking to other people, I think the thing is talking about it, because I don't know whether, I hope that this has changed, but I did feel that there was this sort of pressure after graduation to sort of, you have to get a training contract, have to get on a grad scheme. And if you don't do that, then not that your friends or peers, etc., will see you as a failure, but there's always that worry, like, oh, if I don't do this, is it because there's something wrong with me? And the truth is, some things, as cliche as it is, some things are just not meant to be. So I think it's just really important to remember sort of anything that you had a goal for, which you didn't succeed in, whether it's a job or something else, that wasn't, I think it's just important to remember that there is always going to be something else. There's always going to be something else that is better for you. There's always going to be something else that you're sort of better suited for. So because the role that because I said before, I sort of ended up working for the domestic abuse sector sort of by not accident, but it's not necessarily something I sort of had a plan for, because I was already working for a charity supporting children and young people, and then I had this opportunity, this training, and if I had been doing a different, job, that had been something I would have had the chance to do. So yeah, I think it's just important to remember that if you're not successful in something, there is always going to be something else for you that is better.
That's a wonderful positive message for us to send people. Thank you. And Olivia.
Yeah, I actually really agree with that. I have never in the long term been upset about not getting an opportunity. Like sometimes it can feel really crushing, but then a couple of weeks later I'm like, oh well, never mind, and there is genuinely always something else. Like you get this feeling where you're like, I've got to get it, and it's like feeling in your kind of gut, and you're like, got to have that opportunity, and then you don't get it, it's crushing. And then you find you have that exact same feeling a few weeks later about something different. So yeah, I would completely agree. And so that's, yeah, great point. Challenge. So the question was around challenges. Well, I think one thing that did surprise me was, I think particularly within the tech industry, it is, and great day to talk about this, International Women's Day, but it is male dominated. And I don't know, maybe I was a bit naive when I left university, but I just thought, I won't be affected by, sexism or whatever. I don't know why. I just had this kind of attitude, like, I'll be all right. I'll just call it out. I'll just battle against it. And I do, but then you look like the problem even more. So that's one thing that I've always found quite tricky in various different roles that I've had. Sometimes I've had incidents where people, men at work, can't even really bring themselves to look at me in a meeting because I'm a young woman who's making quite a good point, and they're clearly a bit intimidated by that. And I think particularly in the tech industry where things change so quickly, if you're an older person in the industry, you may feel threatened by younger people coming in and maybe in some levels knowing a bit more than you on certain topics. So I've found that to be quite a surprising, quite difficult challenge, and I still haven't quite figured out how to handle situations properly when they do arise, because I've tried everything. I've tried the calling it out. I've tried the, sorry, can I just finish my point actually? You know, I've tried all of the different things. Just carrying on talking when someone tries to talk over you, I've tried that. I don't know what the answer is, but I think that for women, it's worth being prepared for the fact that there may be some additional challenges like that, that you probably won't expect and will be quite surprised, maybe a bit shocked by. And sometimes you'll be shocked by how explicit it feels and is. And just keep going, because you can still succeed, but it may be a bit harder for you, but you can still do it. And you know, I feel that in my product career, at least, I got to a point that I wanted to get to. It felt like very hard work, but I got there. And I guess that would be one thing that I'd want to kind of prepare women for, particularly because it's surprising and it's difficult and it's sometimes very upsetting, but you can do it.
That's, again, very helpful and bringing something very positive out of what have clearly been very difficult situations. I think our approach in Aidan's is that all genders have to be part of these solutions. So I think raising awareness that these are still issues, trying to understand also what lies behind certain behaviours, trying to understand the structural nature sometimes, and I'm probably exploring strategies for navigating this. A lot depends on the forum, doesn't it? I mean, sometimes you're in a one-off forum and that could be particularly difficult. But if it's a regular forum, then there have to be routes that we can take so that the challenge gets properly embedded. And it's all about the way we deal with things. And I think we do come under a lot of pressure, because on the one hand, we are given the responsibility of calling things out. And on the other hand, often women who do try to challenge things are then stereotyped or marginalized in some way. And really, a lot of this is at some level institutional, isn't it? So I suppose our big question and challenge is, how do we bring about institutional change? And universities are not immune. So I think we all have our soul searching going on, and this feeds into wider cultural issues. If what we really want are inclusive environments, certainly we've done a lot of learning, I think, in Aidan's over the years about what it feels like to come into a community where, if you are outgoing, if you perform confidence, even if you don't feel particularly confident, if you're able to engage in certain ways, then it's much easier for you. If you come, for example, with some form of autism, you have fantastic skills, you have so much to contribute. But if the environment isn't enabling you to contribute, then not only are we losing out as a community and the wider world, but it means that someone can find their time at university being much less happy and fulfilling than it should be. So we'll certainly be coming back to you all, not just for the kinds of issues that you've very helpfully outlined today, and you have shared a huge amount with us, but actually about some of these wider issues about community development, because I think 75 years, of which the first 34, it was a women's college, which didn't mean there weren't men in it, of course. And since then, it's a mixed environment of all gender identities. And I really cherish that. But I think we have to constantly ask ourselves, what do we need to be doing to ensure that we are inclusive and that we are helping people prepare for societies that still aren't, but hoping, like all of you, to have some impact in bringing about that wider cultural change. So I know we're right up against the wire here, 5 minutes to go, but any last thoughts? I'll take Helen first, because she may have to literally disappear from the screen. Helen. last thoughts.
Sure. So I mean, I agree completely with Edu and Olivia on this. I think there is a piece about how do you mute the naysayers in your head. You know, I mentioned at the start about that comment that for another student that still 18 years later, that stuck with me. I remembered that. But actually, it's about how you make sure that that doesn't become something destructive for you, because it really can be. And, you know, if you are someone that, you know, maybe struggling to deal with those feelings and those emotions and processing that, I would say reach out as well to others, because again, it doesn't come naturally to all of us to be able to deal with that. And with that in mind, you know, just the importance of being a support to those around you as well. Like, don't add to that, don't play into the narrative of, you know, the jokey, oh, you know, oh, you didn't get it, oh well, but you're not going to amount to much, whatever. Like, it's not okay actually to be part of that. So do challenge that with your peers and be part of that supportive environment. I think that, you know, another thing as well, when it comes to applying for jobs, and this is typical with women as well, how often women will not put themselves forward for roles if we read the job description and we think, oh, I haven't done some of those things, so I'm not going to do it. Whereas proportionally, men may be more confident in doing so. It's not everybody, of course, but proportionally. So I think that that's a really important part in terms of saying, actually, it's not necessarily about having done everything that is listed on a JD. A JD may well be aspirational, honestly. And I can say that as someone that works with job descriptions all the time across my teams, right? And we try and make sure that it's really focused on what's essential and what's going to be delivered. So if you think you've got some of it, but you've got transferable skills to say, hey, I've done this in something else, and I think that skill will help me to do this, and I can learn that on the job, then say that. That's okay. And it's hard to sell ourselves in that way, but I would recommend like looking at competency frameworks and doing some reading around like competency-based models. Just always be learning, observing, I think. And that, again, that doesn't necessarily mean going on paid courses. It's about what can you take from the experiences that you have, and what can you be reading and observing of others and talking to others that have done it. So yeah, I think that's important. In terms of a challenge, I'll say absolutely, I've experienced some of the things that Olivia was talking about. I have one example where I was a senior member of a team, and then everyone I thought had left the room. It was at the end of a meeting, and then, you know, the white male men in their kind of mid-late 40s and 50s stayed there, and then we're all talking about me without realizing that I was in the corner saying, you need to keep her in check. And again, I know, shocking, because I had been quite challenging in that meeting and really reflected on that afterwards. And I absolutely challenged my boss afterwards and had those conversations, and we dealt with that formally. But, you know, these are some of the things that sometimes can happen. But I still was looking at that and saying, okay, well, what can I learn from that experience? But actually, was I my authentic self? And do I feel that I did everything appropriately? If I didn't, are the things that I can learn from that. But if actually there are things there that are gender-based that aren't appropriate, then I'm going to call it out and I'm going to make sure that that's tackled. Now, I would say that that's earlier in my career, and I do think tides are changing. And I think actually a lot of the youth now, for me, are a huge inspiration in that actually you're challenging things far more than perhaps we did. So keep doing that, keep trailblazing, keep challenging. And if something doesn't align with your values, you know, stay true to your integrity, and whether that's challenging it, voting with your feet, whatever it may be. But as long as you're true to you on the journey, that's what matters.
Wonderful. Thank
Just
you.
to add on that as well, like you're paid to have an opinion. And if you're voicing your opinion, I mean, challenging is quite a gendered word as well. Like, are you not just being assertive? I've been called fiery. Am I not just being assertive? Do I not just have an opinion? But I'm finding it hard because nobody's listening to me, so I've become a bit more animated. Like, you know, it's not a fire. I don't have a confrontational personality. I'm just trying to be listened to. So anyway, yeah, some of these things are just a bit silly.
Yes, yes, and I think we've all, the power of language, and of course, Idu, with your background in languages, this is something we take with us through our lives. I'm always very sensitive to language and its uses and misuses. So any final words from you?
yeah, just to echo what both Olivia and Helen said, I think in terms of, calling, it's never easy to, it's a bit contradictory here, what I'm going to say. I think if you're I think always call it out if you can, but if you don't feel, especially if you're sort of someone on the receiving end of that, don't underestimate how difficult that is. So if you're not sort of, if you, don't sort of, because at the end of the day, just always remember at the end of the day, you're not the problem. I would say, if you're comfortable, if you're able to call it out, absolutely do so. But if you don't feel, if there's not anyone sort of, for example, place of work that you're not comfortable talking to, do talk to, I would always stress it's really important, do reach out to someone, like Helen and Olivia said, do talk to someone, whether it's a friend, whether, a mentor, it can be anyone really, but I would also always say, if you're going sort of through anything like that, do talk to, it's really important to share that with someone, because it's a big load to carry on your own. And I think women are so, used to just sort of, there's this narrative that, we can do everything, we're strong, we can hold everything together, we go over and above. And I think that is sometimes to our detriment. And it's really important that, like we said, lean on our support systems and ask for help, because it's okay to ask for help always.
Wonderful. I can't thank you enough. This has been genuinely inspiring, and we've just scratched the surface, haven't we? So we will be coming back to you as we celebrate 75 years of St Aidan's College. And I'd like to thank you not only for what you've done today, but for the contributions you all made when you were students here, and Helen additionally as JCR President. I really hope there will be other young women in our college who will follow in your footsteps. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Everyone. Thank you for having me.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.